so much more than you all can even imagine. So I love and appreciate and cherish every one of you all. Thank you so much, and we will discuss in the next video. I wanted to come back with a bang, and after discovering that Jack the Ripper has been identified, I was like, yep, that's it. I'm doing a video over that to come back. And before I start, I don't know if you all watch Spooky Ann ASMR, but right after I finished filming, I saw that she uploaded a Jack the Ripper video, and I love her videos. So if you all like the spooky content and are interested in true crime, please go check out Spooky Ann ASMR. And I actually haven't watched her Jack the Ripper video yet, but I was like, I'm gonna bring it up in this because I'm sure you all will learn something new from both videos. So I won't keep you all waiting. We will dive right in. And if you like true crime, if you like whisper rambles, then you have come to the right place. Please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting. I love reading your all's comments, and you know that I do my best to reply to all of them. So thank you, thank you, thank you so much. And let's dive into Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that was active in England between August 1888 and November of 1888. He has 5 confirmed victims. They were all killed in or near the Whitechapel district of London's East End. And back in these times, in 1888, they were known as the Whitechapel murders. Today, this location is a heavy tourist destination. My friend is actually studying abroad in London right now, and she got to visit that museum that is there, the Jack the Ripper Museum, so I will have to ask her how that went. No suspects were ever identified or arrested until recently, and we will get there. First, let's talk about and shed some light on the confirmed victims in the order that they were found. There are 5 confirmed victims, but he is expected to have murdered at least 5 to 10 more women, but these women could not be definitively linked to him. So the first lady we will discuss is Mary Ann Nichols. She was born on August 26th of 1845 and is the daughter of Edward Walker, a blacksmith, and Caroline Walker. She married William Nichols in 1864, and they had 5 children together. Their marriage was very troubled. He supposedly had been having an affair with a nurse that took care of Mary Ann during her pregnancies, and Mary Ann had developed an alcohol problem. They separated in 1881, and William stopped providing financial support in 1882 after discovering that she had been working as a prostitute. After the separation, Nichols lived in and out of workhouses. She would sometimes stay with her father or live with her first love, Thomas Dew. They dated for several years in their teenage years into their 20s. She also worked briefly as a domestic servant for a nice family, she says, and during her stay with this family, she wrote to her father, quote, "I I just write to say you will be glad to know that I am settled in my new place and going all right up to now. My people went out yesterday and have not returned, so I am left in charge. It is a grand place inside, with trees and gardens back and front. All has been newly done up. They are teetotalers and religious, so I ought to get on. I'm not sure what that first word means. Teetotalers. So if you know, please educate me. She goes on to say, they are very nice people, and I have not too much to do. I hope you are all right and the boy has work. So goodbye for now. From yours truly, Polly. End quote. But she was soon after fired from this job after the family caught her stealing clothing. By 1888, she was living in lodging houses and Spitalfields, struggling with her alcoholism, and she was resorting to work for her survival. The night of her death was August 31st, 1888. At 11 p.m., she was seen walking on Whitechapel Road. She was said to have appeared very drunk. At 12:30 a.m., she leaves Frying Pan Pub and returns to her lodging house. But by 1:30, she was forced to leave as she lacked the money that she needed to get a bed. At 2:30 a.m., she encounters a woman named Emily Holland, who describes her as very drunk. And at 3:40 a.m., she was found deceased by Carmen Charles Cross and Robert Paul in Bucks Row. I won't get too graphic because I know that there are young teens that watch my channel, but she was killed with a deep throat cut, and she had extensive abdominal mutilations. Dr. Reese Ralph Llewellyn examined her at 4:00 a.m. and confirmed that she had died recently. Her body was identified by friends and family. I can't even imagine. And she was buried on September 6th of 1888 at the City of London Cemetery in an unmarked grave, and was later given a memorial plaque in 1996. Nichols was the first confirmed victim of Jack the Ripper. The second is Annie Chapman. Annie Chapman was born Annie Eliza Smith in September of 1841. She was the daughter of George Smith and Ruth Chapman. She had a challenging life marked by illness, personal loss, and financial hardship. She married John Chapman, a coachman, in 1869. They had 3 children together, one of whom passed away young, and another was disabled and sent to an institution. The couple separated around 1884 to 1885, and after John's death in 1886, Annie struggled financially, so she turned to odd jobs wherever she could find them, and later prostitution to survive. In the days leading up to her death, Annie was sick. She was suffering from malnutrition and tuberculosis. She had a dispute with a woman named Eliza Eliza Cooper, which resulted in bruises on her face and her chest. On the night of September 7th, 1888, she was seen at a lodging house in Spitalfields, but left around 1:35 a.m. to go out and try to get some money to get a bed. At approximately 5:30 a.m. on September 8th, a witness claimed to see her speaking to a man on Honbury Street. Shortly after, another witness says that they heard a woman say, quote, "No," end quote, followed by a thud. Annie's mutilated body was discovered at 6 a.m. in the backyard of 29 Honbury Street. Her throat had been deeply cut, and her body had been severely mutilated with, trigger warning, her organs had been removed, and the medical examiner says that the killer seemed to have extensive anatomical knowledge, meaning that with how the cuts were made and how intricately he displayed her organs, he seemed to know what he was doing, which is very disturbing. Further trigger warning: the abdomen had been entirely cut open, and her intestines had been lifted out of her body and placed on her shoulder. And then her uterus and lady organs had been completely removed, and no traces of them could be found, meaning he took them with him, which is just, I don't have words. He thought, the medical examiner, that he himself could not have even performed all of the injuries he described in under an hour. So, the medical examiner says that this had to have taken him at least an hour to do. And it just breaks my heart that somebody heard a cry for help and didn't do anything, which is actually called the bystander effect, by the way. It happens a lot more than we think, where people witness an emergency, but they think, oh, it doesn't involve me. Somebody else will hear the same thing and call for help. So please, if you hear or see something, report it. Okay? Okay. Annie Chapman was the second confirmed victim of Jack the Ripper. The third, Elizabeth Stride, was born in Sweden in 1843, and she moved to London in 1866. She worked as a domestic servant and later married John Stride in 1869, but their marriage eventually fell apart. She lived in poverty, and she frequently received aid from a Swedish church and stayed in common lodging houses. She was also known to be a heavy drinker, and she had multiple arrests for public drunkenness and disorderly behavior. On the night of September 29th or 30th of 1888, Stride was last seen alive talking with various men on Burner Street. At around 12:45 a.m., this is a quote from files regarding the investigation of this murder. Quote, Israel Schwartz of 22 Helen Street stated that at this hour, 12:45 a.m., he turned into Burner Street from Commercial Road, and having gotten as far as the gateway where the murder was committed, he saw a man stop and speak to a woman who was standing in the gateway. He tried to pull the woman into the street, but he turned her around and threw her down on the footway, and the woman screamed 3 times, but not very loudly. On crossing to the opposite side of the street, he saw a second man lighting his pipe. The man who threw down the woman called out, apparently to the man on the opposite side of the road, quote, "Lipsky," end quote, and then Schwartz walked away. But finding that he was followed by the second man, he ran as far as the railway arch, but the man did not follow him this far, end quote. At 1 a.m., Louis Diemschutz, a salesman of jewelry, entered Dudfield's yard driving his cart and pony. Immediately at the entrance, his pony shied and refused to go on. Diemschutz suspected something was in the way, but could not see since the yard was utterly pitch black. He probed forward with his whip and came into contact with a body. He initially believed that this person was either drunk or asleep. He entered the International Working Men's Educational Club to get some help in waking up the woman. But upon returning to the yard with 2 other men, the 3 discovered that she was dead after seeing that her throat had been cut. It was believed that Diemschutz's arrival frightened Jack the Ripper, causing him to flee before he performed his signature mutilations. Diemschutz himself stated that he believed the Ripper was still in the yard when he entered, due to the warm temperature of the body and the continuingly odd behavior of his pony. Very creepy. But yes, so I guess Jack the Ripper had been interrupted after this killing, and so she only had a cut to her neck. I say only at that, as if that isn't terrible. This is a rough one, which, I mean, I'm sure most people have heard of Jack the Ripper, but it is brutal what happened to these poor women, and especially in like the 1800s, women who were prostitutes or sex workers were at risk for high victimization, unfortunately, because of their exposure to these men that have access to them, and it's just so sad. So, Stride's murder remains unsolved, but she is considered Jack the Ripper desk, so I hope you enjoyed the brief ice sounds. Picking right back up where we left off, the fourth victim is Catherine Eddowes. She was born on April 14th of 1842 in Graiseley Green, Wolverhampton. At the time of her death, she is 5 feet tall, has hazel eyes, and dark auburn hair. One thing I found interesting is that she has a tattoo in blue ink on her left forearm of the initials TC. At the time of her death, Catherine Eddowes is suffering from Bright's disease, which is a form of uremia. Friends spoke of Catherine as an intelligent, scholarly woman, but one who, quote, was possessed of a fierce temper, end quote. Catherine was born to George Eddowes, a tin-plate worker, and Catherine Evans. Her family moved from Wolverhampton to London, where she was educated at St. John's Charity School. After her parents passed away, she returned to Wolverhampton to live with an aunt and continued her education at Dowgate Charity School. As a young woman, she became involved with Thomas Conway, a military pensioner, and she traveled with him, selling cheap books and gallows ballads. They had 3 children together but never married, and eventually separated in 1881. After this, Catherine moved into a lodging house in London and began a relationship with John Kelly, who was a laborer. She was described as a generally cheerful woman who occasionally drank, but she was not known to be a prostitute. In 1888, Catherine and Kelly worked as hop pickers before returning to London, struggling financially. And shortly before her death, she reportedly claimed to know the identity of the Whitechapel murderer, though this claim is unverified. On September 29th of 1888, Catherine Eddowes was released from the casual ward and met John Kelly at Cooney's lodging house. They pawned Kelly's boots for money, bought food, and ate breakfast together. But by the afternoon, they were out of money again, and Eddowes left to seek money from her daughter, but she was never able to get in contact with her. At 8 p.m., Eddowes was found drunk and lying on the pavement on Aldgate High Street. She was taken to Bishopsgate Police Station, where she remained in a cell. By 12:55 a.m. on September 30th, she was deemed sober and released at 1 a.m. She was reported to have been making jokes with the officer before leaving in the opposite direction of her lodging house. At 1:35 a.m., 3 men saw Eddowes speaking with a man near Church Passage. She appeared to be comfortable around him. But 10 minutes later, at 1:45 a.m., PC Edward Watkins discovered her murdered in Mitre Square. There was a quantity of clotted blood on the pavement on the left side of her, and this was around her shoulder and the upper part of her arm. Her body was still warm, and no rigor mortis had taken place, so she had most likely been deceased within a half hour of her discovery. Medical examiners looked for superficial bruises but could find none. Her cause of death was hemorrhage from her left common carotid artery. So it was speculated after this discovery that the women's deaths were immediate and the mutilations were inflicted after death. She was buried on Monday, the 8th of October in 1888. Alright, the last confirmed victim we will be talking about is Mary Jane Kelly, who was approximately 25 years old at the time of her death, which would place her birth around 1863. She was 5'7" and described as tall and stout. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a fair complexion. Maria Harvey, a friend of hers, states, quote, "She was much superior to that of most persons in her position in life," end quote. She spoke fluent Welsh, and another friend, Joseph Barnett, says that he, quote, "always found her of sober habits," end quote. Her landlord says, quote, "When in liquor she was very noisy, otherwise she was a very quiet woman," end quote. Mary Jane Kelly's background is largely known through her partner, Joseph Barnett, though some details of his stories are conflicting. She was born in Limerick, Ireland, and moved to Wales as a child. Her father worked in ironworks, and she had several siblings, including a brother in the Scots Guards. She came from a well-off family and she was described as well-educated and artistically talented. At 16, she married a collier named Davies, who later died in an explosion. After this incident, she moved to Cardiff, where she lived with a cousin and worked as a prostitute before relocating to London in 1884. She may have worked in a high-class brothel and even had traveled to Paris before ending up in the East End of London, where she unfortunately fell into poverty and developed a drinking problem. By 1886, she was living in Spitalfields and met Joseph Barnett, with whom she moved around with quite a bit to different lodging houses. They moved to Miller's Court in early 1888. Barnett lost his job in September, and she returned to sex work. In late October, he left her after she began to shelter other prostitutes in their room, but he continued to visit her. On November 7th, she was seen speaking with a, quote, well-dressed man, end quote, outside of Miller's Court, and she was murdered in her room on November 9th, 1888, in what is known to be Jack the Ripper's most gruesome killing. Boyer states that on Wednesday night he saw a man speaking to Kelly who looked a lot like the description of the man Matthew Backer claims to have seen with Elizabeth Stride. His appearance was described as smart, and attention was drawn to him by his white cuffs and long was in Miller's Court. This woman is suspected to be Lizzie Albrook. This is a quote from Albrook about Mary Jane. Quote, "About the last thing she said to me was, 'Whatever you do, don't you do wrong and turn out as I did.' She had often spoken to me in this way and warned me against going on the street as she had done. She told me, too, that she was heartily sick of the life she was leading and wished she had enough money to go back to Ireland where her people lived. I do not believe she would have gone out as she did if she had not been obliged to do so to keep herself from starvation." End quote. And I thought that was a very important quote to add because it just shows the desperation and the poverty that these people were facing during this time. So here is a timeline leading up to Mary Jane's death. Mary Jane Kelly was last definitively seen by a woman named Mary Ann Cox around 11:45 p.m. She was entering her room at Miller's Court with a stout, shabbily dressed man who was carrying a case of beer. Shortly after, Kelly was heard singing "A Violet from Mother's Grave" until around 1 a.m. At 2 a.m., George Hutchinson saw Kelly meeting with a well-dressed man whom he described in detail. He followed them to Miller's Court, where they entered together, and at 4 a.m., a cry of, quote, "Oh, murder," end quote, was heard by two witnesses, but was ignored. Two witnesses, Caroline Maxwell and Maurice Lewis, later claimed to have seen Kelly alive between 8:30 to 10 a.m., but this conflicted with the medical examiner's estimated time of death. At 10:45 a.m., Thomas Bauer was sent to collect overdue rent, and he was the one who discovered Kelly's mutilated body through the window. The police arrived, and after waiting for bloodhounds, the dogs that they use in crime scene investigations, they broke down the door, finding her remains in a horrific state. Her face was cut beyond recognition, as was the rest of her body, which just shows how dehumanizing he was in his killings. Her cause of death was a severed carotid artery. And that concludes the confirmed victims. Now we are going to talk about the letters that Jack the Ripper sent in to police, because he loved the attention that the police and this investigation was bringing to him. And that just shows how disturbed he was. So there's several letters. You can find them online, but I will be reading 2 or 3 of the most infamous. The first one is the Dear Boss's letter. It was received on September 27th of 1888 at Central News Agency. The letter was believed to be a hoax originally, but 3 days later, the murder of Stride and Eddowes made them reconsider this, especially because they learned that a portion of an earlobe was found cut off from the victim's body, and this was something that Jack the Ripper had stated he was going to do in this letter. So, this letter was released to the public to see if anyone would recognize his handwriting. And the letter states, "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about the leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on wars, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue, so I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ear off and send it to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind giving me the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha." The next letter is called From Hell. Mr. Lusk, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk. So, again, I am sure you are speechless after hearing that. I sure was while reading it. Clearly this was a very evil individual, and I don't like to describe people as definitively evil or good, but I think this man is an exception. Now, talking about the investigation. So, I will be reading a couple of articles to you, and these are the articles that recently came out going in detail about the identity of Jack the Ripper, which has finally been discovered over 100 years later. During the investigation at the time, Frederick Aberleens was hired to figure the murder out because of his familiarity with Whitechapel's criminal landscape. He was a top-tier investigator at that time, and he did not have success because the Ripper was an opportunistic killer, and Aberleens' specialty was mostly dealing with gangs. So, unfortunately, Jack the Ripper was not discovered during this time. The police also distrusted the press, fearing that the leaks would hinder the investigation. But despite this, journalism took over, and rumors and false leads, and this stretched police resources thin because, of course, the public was freaking out and things just got chaotic and no leads were ever discovered. So, a debate in this time was whether or not a reward should be offered for information, but a home office policy deemed a reward ineffective and counterproductive. So the investigation relied on traditional police methods, but there were only vague descriptions and no artist sketches were based on witness accounts. So it remained unsolved for over a century. Here is the first article that highlights his discovery, finally. I will be reading important parts of an article on jacktheripper.org. So, according to Melville McNaughton, Jack the Ripper, or Aaron Kosminski, was, quote, a Polish Jew and a resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum in March of 1889. Okay, Kosminski was a Polish-born immigrant whose father, Abram Joseph Kosminski, was a tailor. We aren't sure exactly when Aaron arrived in London, but it was suspected to be around 1880 to 1881. We don't know much about his early life in London, but his medical records state that his occupation was a hairdresser. By mid-1890, he was displaying symptoms of mental illness, and he was admitted to Mild End Old Town Workhouse on July 12th of 1890. His stay in this place was a relatively short one, and he was discharged only 3 days later. He was readmitted in 1891, and at this time he was certified as insane, and on February 7th of 1891 he was transferred to the Middlesex County Lunatic Asylum. The admission book states that his age is 26, and that the cause of his insanity enlisted the cause of his insanity as unknown. Although, quote, self-abuse, end quote, was later added. The admission book states that he was not a danger to others, which is very odd considering he has now been confirmed to be Jack the Ripper. The admission book also lists this fact about him. He was said to be, quote, a medical man. And this is a direct quote from that book. Quote, he declares that he is guided and his movements altogether controlled by an instinct that informs his mind. He says that he knows the movements of all mankind. He refuses food from others because he is told to do so, and he also eats out of the gutter for the same reason, end quote. And this is a quote from Jacob Cohen, who is a witness to this. Quote, he goes about the streets and picks up bits of bread from the gutter and eats them, drinks water from the tap, and refuses food at the hands of others. He took up a knife and threatened the life of his sister. He is very dirty and will not be washed. He has not attempted any kind of work for years." End quote. Aaron Kosminski would spend just over 3 years at Colney Hatch Asylum, where he was described as being extremely deluded and morose, quote, "rather difficult to deal with on account of the dominant character of his delusions," end quote. On April 19th, 1894, he was transferred to Leavesden Asylum, where he would spend the remaining 25 years of his life, and he died here on March 24th, 1919. He was described as, quote, "incoherent, apathetic, and excitable," end quote, "dull and vacant," end quote. The second article I will be reading is titled "Jack the Ripper Researcher Who Claims to Have Identified the Serial Killer with 100% DNA Match Seeks Closure." Russell Edwards claims Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber, is the serial killer. This was published by Bailey Richards on February 15th, 2025. One of the biggest serial killer mysteries of all time, the identity of Jack the Ripper, has finally been solved, according to a British researcher who is now seeking legal confirmation on behalf of a victim's family. Over a century after he murdered and mutilated London women in 1888, the long mythologized killer's identity has been allegedly confirmed by DNA found on a shawl. Russell Edwards claimed that Aaron Kosminski, a barber who was 23 at the time of the murders, is the Ripper based on what he said is a 100% match with DNA found on the attire piece. The shawl ultimately incriminated Kosminski, per the researcher, was taken from the scene of Catherine Eddowes' 1888 murder in London's Mitre Square, which later came into Edwards' possession in 2007. Speaking about the alleged killer with Today Australia, Edwards says Kosminski had schizophrenia and was admitted into an asylum. The historian also noted that in 19th century London, his occupation as a barber, or, quote, barber surgeon, end quote, as it was called at the time, further points to him fitting the Ripper bill. Quote, "In those days, you had anatomical knowledge as a barber, which when you know the case, you know that the murderer must have had anatomical knowledge to commit the acts that he did," end quote, Edwards told the outlet. Citing an alleged 1891 document that named Kosminski a strong suspect, the researcher also said that the barber, quote, "had strong homicidal tendencies," end quote, was prone to solitary vices and auditory hallucinations, end quote. Edwards, who is the author of the book naming Jack the Ripper, has long believed Kosminski to be the infamous London killer, a claim that he first made over a decade ago. The historian allegedly confirmed that Kosminski's DNA was on Eddowes' shawl with the help of Dr. Jari Luhelinen, a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University, who isolated small segments of DNA from bloodstains on the garment. segments were then matched with a direct descendant of Eddowes, while DNA from semen stains on the shawl matched with a descendant of Kosminski. Some people doubted Edwards' findings, as the DNA evidence integral to his claim has not been published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Yet he, along with 10 descendants of Eddowes's, who all want closure, are seeking legal acknowledgement that Kosminski is the man responsible for her and the other victims' murders. A lengthy process they have already begun. Part of this closure, the historian said, will come from seeing Kosminski's name linked to the murders, not Jack the Ripper. Quote, "Really what we want is to stop the name being bannered around," end quote, he told Today Australia. Quote, "Because the name actually was created by an enterprising journalist and doesn't have anything to do with the murder whatsoever, but this is the name given to this murderer," end quote. The historian also hopes to see, quote, "no more people coming up with false, I would say, suspects," end quote. He told the outlet, quote, "So basically we want to close the story," end quote. Now, some of the comments argue that Aaron Kosminski is not the killer because the only evidence that is definitive is the semen DNA match that they found on this one shawl. And people argue that because his victims were prostitutes, that he may have just been hiring her for a service and not actually the murderer. I think that he is a fitting match, but at the same time, it is a valid argument that he was just a disturbed man who hired her for sex. So in reality, I guess we don't know, but I hope that for the sake of the victims and their families, it can be definitively linked to this man. I am not sure what other research has been done on him, and since it was so long ago, I don't know how much more research and scientific evidence can be brought about. I think out of all of the suspects, Aaron is the most fitting, but there are multiple suspects in these cases. There's endless ones, and they all have pros and cons, which makes it very difficult to determine the true identity. However, I think this lead is credible, and I hope that more research can be done one day. And I think it's heartbreaking that the descendants of the victims don't have answers, and assuming which, obviously the real identity of Jack the Ripper is deceased, and so justice cannot be served, which makes this even more devastating.